Good afternoon. I'm Amanda Krugliak, curator at the Institute for the Humanities Gallery, and welcome to another year of programming. I'm here today with artist James Hosking. He is a Chicago-based photographer, filmmaker, visual artist, and documentarian. His portraiture explores the underseen LGBTQ+ communities and subcultures. He often combines multiple images to explore the complexities of identity and visual representation. James Hosking lived in San Francisco's Tenderloin neighborhood from 2010 to 2018, during which time he created the series of photographs and video, Beautiful by Night. The exhibition presents intimate portraits of 3 longtime drag performers at Aunt Charlie's Lounge, a small bar that has been so meaningful to San Francisco's LGBTQ+ community for decades, and really everyone in the community knows of Aunt Charlie's. And now it literally is the last surviving gay bar in the neighborhood. I wanted to have a conversation today with James, whose exhibition is in the Institute Gallery, Beautiful by Night, to talk about the project and the choices he made and its origins. Welcome, James.
Hi, Amanda. It's great to see you.
Nice to see you too. Let's just talk first about the origins of the project and how it kind of came to be and your relationship to the ladies in the exhibition.
Sure. So I moved to San Francisco in 2009, and I stumbled upon Aunt Charlie's and quickly fell in love with it. The performers were extremely vivid and diverse in their ages and performance style, in polish levels and presentation. And it was like a space I'd never been in before. It didn't have a typical stage. People performed in kind of a makeshift area where the tables were really close. And so the intimacy with the performers and their kind of fearlessness in interacting with the crowd was really something that I had never experienced before. But I think it was also the combination of how the bar fit into the Tenderloin neighborhood, which is a neighborhood that had some of the first porn theaters in America, some of the first jazz clubs in America, and has long struggled with issues of addiction, unhoused populations, but has an incredibly vibrant feeling to it, unique feeling to it, and kind of a grit that many cities have banished to their margins or got rid of altogether. And so there were some performers who I was very drawn to, and I came upon the idea of starting to photograph them. And one of my favorites actually passed away. Her name was Vicki Marlane, and she was in her mid-70s. And she had actually started the drag show that all the photos take place during. And so I was saddened by her death, and I felt like if I was going to begin photographing, I needed to do so soon, because many of the performers that I was interested in were also older, and I just kind of felt the ephemerality of Aunt Charlie's in general. You don't know how long something's going to exist for. And so I began photographing in general at the club. And then as I photographed for a year or two, I kind of decided to work more closely with Olivia, Colette, and Donna because of their personalities, their vibrancy, and also their openness to working with me with the project and sharing their lives. And they've never been anything less than completely welcoming and accommodating and full of good humor, and never said no. And I've learned to kind of work with them as well, of when they like to be photographed or when it's appropriate to photograph them. And we made the photographs with them over a few years. And kind of I grew with them as a photographer and an artist as we went on this journey together.
I think what's telling about it, and it really shows in the work, is your closeness to the subjects, that they really feel like friends, they really feel like neighbors, and that you're not coming to it from this outside vantage point. And then as a viewer, you really become engaged with the protagonists of the exhibition, and you feel a great deal for them. You feel close to them. And so there's this wonderful way that your observations and capturing their everyday comings and goings, whether it's mundane or something, extraordinary on stage, that as a viewer of photographs and the exhibition, you feel really part of that world and have that intimacy as well, which is just so remarkable. It also brings to mind, you and I have these conversations about why this is especially important right now, and how there is a feeling for all of us where we're craving too that intimacy and that sense of connection. So do you feel that too? Is the work showing it in this moment different for you than it has been in the past?
Oh yeah. I mean, Aunt Charlie's is open now. It wasn't for a while. I think the community really missed Aunt Charlie's and feared for its future. We've lost so many LGBT spaces during the pandemic. But when I was making the work, I had imagined the idea of a pandemic, but I didn't, of course, anticipate what would happen. And I think the performers have had to change their ideas about existing within the club and how to do so safely. And so, yeah, in a weird way, the images kind of harken back to a time very close, but feels very far away.
Definitely.
Very little social distancing. I'm obviously in their homes, which many of us have tried to keep kind of as closed off as possible and insular so that we could avoid getting the virus. But the nature of performance and drag performance is moving from the private, from getting ready and those private rituals to a communal experience, a social experience, which has been difficult to have over the last few years.
Yeah. And for those that aren't really as familiar with the Tenderloin neighborhood of San Francisco, I think what's so beautiful about that city, or always has been so vibrant, is because it's a relatively small city and compact, that all of these neighborhoods and people and different lifestyles and ways of being are always overlapping. And so just that energy of the engagement within that city of different communities, different parts and facets of the community is really what makes it so special. So
yeah, and if I could add that, the Tenderloin is one of the most densely populated areas, maybe in California. I might be incorrect there, but it's certainly the highest concentration of single room occupancy hotels, I believe, in America. So within, a small 7x7 radius, 7x7 mile radius of the city, it still has a very urban, very tight community feeling, for better or for worse sometimes, but especially, where we shot many of these photos and the apartments and the single room occupancy hotels where they live, you feel very much the sense of the city and trying to carve out a private space amongst so many people.
Yeah. Well, you keep talking about, private and public, and that's something we've discussed as well, this idea of private and public space. Do you want to say anything more about that as it pertains to the project?
Yeah, I mean, many of the photos also, they work with mirrors. And I think that, even in a public social space like a dressing room, you can have a private relationship with yourself in the mirror. But, more broadly, they allowed me to come into their homes and document private rituals in their private space, which felt like an incredible privilege. And also is a lot of what the series is about. How do people spend time with their self-image and how they wish themselves to be seen? How did they reach that? While also fighting some of the more mundane aspects of getting ready and the kind of routine of it, and keep that excitement and that reinvention alive, or not. But yeah, Aunt Charlie's, there's images of the performance in the bar area, but the emphasis is on carving out your own space and your own place to consider your identity within a city.
I think there are a couple things about this I wanted to talk a little more about, which one, the fact that we've discussed this way you connect with the images and you feel immersed in this world. But on the other hand, as you said, they're mostly images of people in isolation. So like it's this dichotomy in regards to the intimacy of the image, but also being reminded too of how the subjects, the photographs, are often alone or grappling, in their own private space. So I think that, that's something that really comes through, that double edge of that. And then the other thing is that San Francisco has always had clubs for small theaters, or the drag clubs, and all of these things that existed in the moment in small, somewhat intimate spaces. But we're in this world now where nothing is really private like that. Everything is immediately on Instagram or on Facebook or Twitter, or someone's in the audience taking it out in real time, right?
Yeah.
So it feels very different to me, that performance world, and the way that it had this intimacy that still exists, but the whole world's changed.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the way I shot the series and the film stocks I used and the cameras I used were an effort to create a bit more of a sense out of time. It was both contemporary, but it was also harkening back to photographers from other eras who used color and black and white in expressive ways. And it makes those images that they took feel both very obviously of the era. I'm thinking of Susan Meiselas and Carnival Strippers. It's hard to look at those and not think that they're from the 70s because of the hairstyles and the fashion, but also the way that she uses bodies in space and the angles of space. I have this one photo where there's a carnival barker outside and the ladies and the crowd, and the geometries and angles of it are always interesting for me to look at. So how could I take these things that people are always capturing, right, on cell phone video in a very offhanded way, not without their own artistry sometimes, but how can I try to find compositions in depth, play with color, the expressiveness of color, the tones of black and white, what elements of the foreground can I use to highlight the characters? With the ubiquity of cell phone capture, I felt like I wanted to create a more timeless look for the images. There's also an Anders Peterson book called Cafe Limits, which is about a bar and the people that populate that bar, many of them day drinkers, which is something that happens all the time, right? But the way that he captures it makes it indelible and incredibly memorable. So that was kind of the challenge that I set out for myself. How can I make the dressing room interesting and the bar space interesting? And they're small spaces. So how can I stylize them in a way that makes them feel more spatially interesting and compositionally interesting?
So let's talk about the layout of the show, because the months that we discussed it and tried to figure out, how you wanted this to be laid out, you have Beautiful Mind Night, the film, there are the images. I think there's a relationship between the two. Can you just talk about this very unique way that you thought about putting the exhibition together?
So I think we talked about how would we organize the material as kind of one of the primary questions. And we came upon the idea of having the protagonists, which we cut to in between each other in the film as they get ready to go to Aunt Charlie's. And then they meet at Aunt Charlie's and those scenes are together as they share space within the club. And then as they separate, we cut between them again as they find their way home. So it seemed like for this, we would have individual walls that showcase each protagonist and show a little bit of their journey throughout the night. And so there's parallels that you can find between the walls in terms of the experiences, of course, that are being documented, because they have the same jobs as drag queens, but then there's differences in the compositions and the moments that we capture and the specificity of that person and details related to that. So that was the first piece, is figuring out that each protagonist would have their own space and it would be distinct, and using the text similar to the film to denote whose wall was whose. And then also playing with a challenge that you laid out for me, which was how to incorporate texture into the show. Textures of night in San Francisco, textures of the bar itself. And so we went through many different options and kind of settled on the color blue as something that was indicative of nighttime, a midnight blue, and also had a certain dreaminess to it. Like many of the photos, it's not strictly adherent to reality. And also using the mirror, because there's mirrors in many of the photos, and there's also mirrors in Aunt Charlie's, which is something that are fun to shoot with compositionally, whether it's backstage or in the bar itself, and felt like the truest nod to the club, which is the nexus that connects everyone. And then beyond that, it was the hanging style that we really worked on together and trying to come up with something that felt looser, had a bit of choreography to it. It was more dynamic than a simple centered at 60 inches, sightline, tracking around the room, photo, photo, photo kind of feel. And personally, I was inspired by Paul Graham. And I had seen a show of his at Pier 24 and a series that he did called The Shimmer of Possibility, where he presented mini narratives on the wall in a sequential way, and the hanging was kind of rhythmic and used the way that the images played with each other and played against each other to inform how they were hung, so that it wasn't just even. It had a sense of music to it and timing.
Yeah, and I think that you can't help but make a connection between something that's cinematic or film frames and the way that you create these narratives frame per frame, something that becomes a sequence that in part helps to tell this story. That seems to be something that comes out, whether it's conscious or unconsciously, that connects these two different parts of your practice or ways of storytelling. I'm struck too by what you choose to include or what I would omit, like this idea that curatorially, what would one take out of it, and then as the artist, in terms of the story you're telling it, what is important for you to include?
Mm-hmm.
So can you talk a little bit more about the choices you made as to what to include in telling the story visually?
Yeah, I think as an editorial documentary photographer on assignment, you're looking for a literalization of narrative and kind of an easy path for the viewer to understand core information, usually from text through. And so in this case, we were looking to kind of reduce down and maybe allow the viewer to fill in those moments that aren't documented. So that was something that, again, you challenged me to do in order to create a bit of a sense of mystery, or allow the viewer, like I said, to kind of imagine those missing beats in the story. So that was something that, in editing it, there were some images that just were too repetitive and maybe laid the themes of the show a little too bare. And so excluding them was important, but then also finding images that did mirror each other on the different walls or in a sequence, so that we could further explore some of the themes of, whether it's labor and, like I said prior, the repetition of labor, maybe the kind of grind of drag a little bit. Mm-hmm. So that was something that I returned to in sequencing. Always, is it necessary? And then why is it necessary? And could we take it away and still have it make sense?
I think there are some images that you include that seem so nuanced, really naturalistic, obviously not the glamour shot. And I think that those small pieces for me tell us so much, even though it's not the trope of how one would expect, right, a drag performer to be represented. You never give in to that easy kind of way of representation. Mm-hmm. And it's really these small pieces that feel ambiguous, or you can't find that linear story mm-hmm. around those small pieces that, for me, looking at the work in its entirety, have really become these important elements that otherwise, I feel like there would be so much missing without those very personal, subtle mm-hmm. Images that just give us something, but not everything.
Mm-hmm. I think, a lot of images of drag, films about drag, the dialogue is often about perfection, or, just making it as slick as possible. And I think that the protagonists were willing to go on this journey with me because they were not entirely invested in that. They were more interested in sharing themselves as people and all their different sides. And in the photos, I'm not interested in a perfection of a specific look or a performance style. Sure. I'm interested in showing the moments really outside of performance and how we can learn about these people and where they live through that and the specificity of their existence.
I'm also struck by how responsible and sensitive you are to understanding that there's a certain care that you need as the filmmaker, as the documentarian. Their story is sort of in your hands.
Mm-hmm.
So the way that you tell it, what you choose to reveal, what you may not reveal, that vigilance as an artist is also part of what comes into the work and to your practice.
I mean, I think they're more comfortable with themselves on camera than I would ever be. Mm-hmm. So always checking in and seeing if what you're showing is consistent with what they would like to show. But I think that they also understood, like I said before, that this series was really not about perfect beauty shots or perfect performance shots. It was about those moments that usually precede or follow that, or a moment in performance. Like there's a photo of Donna screaming. And, I think that as a performance shot is interesting to me, because in the frame, she's not surrounded by people, and the performance feels kind of essential and primal. And so for me, that moment of performance is important to include because it shows a part of who she is. Not just because it's a performance shot, where someone's perfectly lip syncing or their outfit is perfect. It's if performance reveals a part of the people I've grown to know, then I'd like to include it.
I wanted to go back just for a minute in thinking about the relationship between us as we thought about this show, and really revealing a little bit more about that, when you think about people working together and having a different aesthetic or playing a different role, and how we really did have conversations about whether there should be a bar in the gallery or whether I wanted a fur wall or, that all of these things that I came to from a performative sort of perspective. And then showing greater, restraint and thinking about what to include in these other ways to bring in that texture.
Yeah, I mean, I think that when we started talking about the adhesive photo text, which goes directly to the wall, and the question of can photos be texture? Can there almost be B-sides to your A-sides to your singles? And so you're adding the photos that provide more context and dimensionality. You're essentially collaging with your own images. I think that really interested both of us as a way not to literalize texture in so much that it's fur, it's sequins, it's dollar bills, but it is images that can deepen the engagement with our primary A-sides, which are in the frames. And I think that there's a demarcation there, right? Institutionally, which you can speak to as a curator, so I won't go on too much, but that the A-sides are in the frames.
And they challenge each other, on the wall, this sort of temporary ephemeral quality of the images printed on the vinyl are challenging this more exact location of the identity that's in the frame, or what is the photograph? What is this thing? Is it forever? Is it permanent? Is it galvanized? The temporary nature of that vinyl and the image on it that could just be pulled away. I think that tension between the two, even in addition to the idea of texture, it's the way that there is a challenge going on all the time in regards to the hierarchy of what is image, where does the identity reside? Where is the story in this? What is the truth? What all of that happens in the way that you thought about composing the wall.
And we've also been extremely deliberative in creating a plan that we then executed on in terms of how it would look. And there's not a great deal of variance. I mean, we did play a little bit, but the plan that we both looked at in Photoshop and then what ended up on the wall, we're making those connections between the images. And there's a certain precision, just like there would be in a book layout. And that's really what also inspired me. The idea of if you put a photo book on the wall, what is it gonna look like? How can you use the wall like a gatefold that folds out? Or, the inside of the pages, where they meet. So that was something that inspired me greatly because I'm a big fan of photo books as well. Because, we're obviously not gonna be able to see photos all the time in a gallery context. And that's so much of how we learn modern photography, contemporary photography is through books.
I love the way that you thought about moving off of the screen in this, very detailed, elaborate plan, and then how it felt when you were in real space. What was that what was that next step from imagining it in this virtual space and then seeing it, in the room?
I mean, I think that's one of the challenges of the time that we were in, was that we never met each other before I came here this January.
Right.
And so, how are you going to, and I've never been in this space, so how are you going to be in this space virtually and create something on a 27-inch monitor that's going to then populate on a 20-foot wall? And so it is a bit of a leap of faith that when you get into the space, it will feel appropriate to the space and it'll work. And luckily, I think it did.
Yeah, me too. Me too.
Yeah.
There's something for me in looking at this work. There's a part of me that it leads me into this, into these new worlds, and it feels so different from what I know personally or understand. And I kind of love the idea of losing myself within these other worlds. And then it starts to feel very much about me, about aging, about beauty, about judgments, our own self-scrutiny, how society views us. So then it feels as if it completely transcends these small worlds, and it feels as if it has something to do, with all of us going through this ongoing process of who we are and how we're viewed, and who cares, what the value of that is. So did that come into focus for you early on, that would happen from this work, or is that something you thought about, or it just is sort of this marvelous result of the work?
Well, I mean, it definitely interested me, their lives and their settings, and I didn't entirely know why. And I think that I gave myself freedom to spend time with them and to explore it without judging myself and my motivations. That through that, the themes of the series kind of developed. The specificity led to the concentration later on. I didn't start out immediately like this is about aging and identity, and
right.
Those things emerged as I began to take photos and also concentrate on the protagonists who have their space in the exhibition. So, I hope that the specificity of the circumstances and the uniqueness of the people can invite people in. And as like you said, which is lovely, they can also learn more about themselves through the images and how they see themselves and their own identity. And also what they give themselves permission to be, or what they give themselves permission to try. Because I think that all of the protagonists are encouraging people to try what they would like to experience.
Yeah. And your use even of the word protagonist, that they're all sort of the star, they're the heroines of their own stories, that magic of all of that aspiring to be is something else that I just love about the work. So I guess last, and maybe it's because you're coming back to this moment we're in, and it still feels so murky, and it's been so trying, and everything for me feels on the surface, of how we are feeling, in addition to just going through the paces of every day. And so when I look at this work, there's this vibrance to the images and the people, and then just like the blueness of the wall, there's this sadness and this darkness also that feels like it is an undercurrent of the work, of being in the space with the work. And so I guess for me, it's almost as if these photographs become traces of artifacts of something in a state of obsolescence. Do you see them that way? Does it feel as if you're creating an artifact of something that's sort of already gone, or is it not so?
Yeah, I mean,
telling.
The title Beautiful by Night is not a judgment. It's a way to say that the state that they're moving through in order to do the performances is transitory, and it's ritualistic in the transformative process that they're undergoing in the arc of the night. So I think by nature, the work is kind of ephemeral. The use of silk, the use of mirror, the delicacy of the material of the silk, and also the way that it's hung in kind of a style that feels a little bit looser and maybe more temporary, as you said, with the photo text. So I think, the nature of a night out and kind of what they're offering through their performances to the audience, the associations that they're bringing to mind, the feeling of Aunt Charlie's, the feeling of the Tenderloin at that particular moment, and the people that made the trip to go there and share that moment with them on the improvised stage of Aunt Charlie's. So I think that all of those things now are more precious through the lens of the pandemic. But I think from the beginning, it was all about documenting something that was fairly ephemeral, and that so much had changed in San Francisco, and that these individuals, the protagonists, were still existing in a place where they were choosing to put a lot of pessimism aside and some of the difficulties that they faced in their lives, and continue to live, their dreams of performing. But with that, was also a bit of a grind, but they always returned to it, and they returned to Aunt Charlie's as the idea of something that they came to San Francisco to experience in the first place. And I think that idea too of a city, of a bar that comes to symbolize something to a group of people that's ephemeral and delicate. And their existences also might be a little bit precarious, but their identity is very steadfast.
Right. Yeah, I think that's a really lyrical way to think about the work. I feel that clarifies for me how the story moves in and out of these different ways of telling it, and the images as well are not this fixed point, but rather this ongoing journey or adventure or experience.
Yeah, and I think that there's, in the way that it's shot, a lot of choices to really distinguish the protagonist from the city with a shallow depth of focus, like you said, maybe excluding other folks from the frame. So there's kind of a singularity to the way that they're presented, a dreaminess to it. So they're each the star of their own narrative. And those narratives intertwine, and we also, as viewers, find our ways into their narratives.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today. It's really great to talk to you more about the exhibition.
Yeah, and I really want to thank you for the opportunity to work with you on this project, and your love and support for the series. It means very much to me.
Yeah, absolutely. It means a great deal to us too. And for goodness sakes, come see the exhibition in person up through February 21st. Please join us.